Welcome, students, to our APUSH Period 2 brief overview. Um, the point of these videos is just to kind of give you a brief, like I said, brief. We can't get into every single detail for the AP exam. Just something to kind of add as an extra thing to make you think, and then you can kind of do the research on your own. So, when we're talking about Period 2, we're specifically talking about Jamestown to the start of the French and Indian War, or also known as the 7 Years' War, if we're talking about European affairs. But really, this idea of Jamestown to the French and Indian War, how these colonies are starting to develop before we start getting into the American Revolution and the protests of the American colonists. So, if we're starting with Jamestown in 1607, Virginia, the whole point of Virginia was to try to find gold. And what really ends up happening is that we start to have a starving time in which I have a person here now with me. He heard starving and then he decided he wanted to get in on this. So, anyway, when we're talking about this starving time, we're talking about the Virginians. These first couple of years, they're not exactly doing so well. Things are going bad. And eventually, John Smith, not the Pocahontas John Smith. Remember, Disney lies to you when it comes to that story. She's going to marry John Rolfe, the guy that, starts to breed the tobacco strains and everything. But when we're talking about John Smith comes with this idea where he says, if you do not work, I do not feed you. So it really started to bring in this idea, at least for new Virginians that are coming in, that they had to work, because a lot of the Virginians that were coming in were, rich, upper class nobility, thought that they were, could just kind of skate through with everything. Not too many women are coming in, but luckily for the John Smith and Virginians, that he does, make peace with the, with the local tribes, the Powhatans, that are there, and that's where, the whole Pocahontas story. So what Virginia really relies on is this idea of brown gold, this tobacco that eventually that they're going to grow and bring back into England, and their business is going to thrive. Now, Virginia is going to be different from the next, colonies, which is going to be up in Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth, because they're going to be more for the religious freedom, the religious ideas of Puritanism that's going to be up in the north. And this is where eventually you're going to get the city upon a hill. This idea that, New England and Boston and everyone up there is just better than everybody else because look at all the moral things that we are doing. Now, at the same time, if you did not follow these moral ideas of, Puritanism, you were kind of kicked out, and this is where Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson go to Rhode Island, and they start their brand new thing. Connecticut then starts that way, specifically Hartford, Connecticut. So you will get fractions within this movement of Puritanism, in which is why those colonies are going to start. But remember, the Pilgrims come over and they get help and whatnot from Squanto and the Wampanoag tribe. I'm sure I slaughtered the name of that, but I apologize. But that's the tribe that deals with specifically with the Pilgrims up in Massachusetts and Plymouth. Okay, and then you start getting, some of these other colonies, like the Deep South, the Carolinas, which is mostly sugar and some tobacco. Georgia is founded as a debtors' prison where people from England, they brought all the debtors over there, and this was James Oglethorpe, and eventually, though, it's going to be a royal colony. Maryland starts because of religious purposes, but then eventually becomes a tobacco area. This is where Lord Baltimore or Calvert comes in, and he starts that first colony down in St. Mary's, Maryland. And then Pennsylvania starts because of the Quakers and William Penn, and it's the city of brotherly love. Now remember, Pennsylvania actually has some of the best Native American relations with the tribes in that area. And, the French are getting involved because French now are going to be in Canada and parts of the Ohio River Valley. They're going to be mostly trading with fur. The Dutch are in like New York and New Jersey and parts of Delaware, and they start New Amsterdam and the New Netherlands, but then they'll eventually lose all these lands in wars to the British. So you just have all of these different mixtures of colonies that are all, kind of coming in and mixing with each other and whatnot. But eventually what's going to happen is that all of these colonies are eventually going to start to kind of mold together, and it's really going to come into a trading aspect, fighting over fur. Eventually, the slave trade is going to come in. But before we do that, this is where the indentured servitude we're going to discuss real fast. Specifically in Virginia, they were definitely using indentured servants before the slave trade had even started. And what the idea was is that you would get free passage to the New World in exchange for 7 years of servitude, and at the very end of these 7 years, you would be granted freedom and some land. Problem is that most of the people that went over would not make it to 7 years because they would probably die. Life expectancy wasn't exactly all that great, so a lot of times this was kind of free labor until they would die. This is where you're going to get a bunch of people in Virginia that are going to start the riot under Nathaniel Bacon, Bacon's Rebellion, in which then he's trying to show and prove that there is an economic disparity between the indentured servants and the rich, plant holders and everything like that. So even though his rebellion wasn't successful, in changing things, it did bring about an idea that, indentured servitude, there is some inequalities, thus the rise of the slave trade. Okay, and we had already talked about in the period one discussion about how the encomienda system was started and how the Spanish then started bringing in African slaves into those areas to replenish the workforce of the Amerindians that were already dying out. So very similar here, that these African slaves are going to be brought in to replace the workforce that is being left open by this vacuum by the indentured servants. Now, other movements that are going on is that you start to have this argument between the Enlightenment that's coming from France, coming over as this logic and reason. Ben Franklin was an enlightened thinker, using science, using, all this like logic and reason to explain things, versus, people like Whitefield that's talking about the Great Awakening, this this new religious revival in which it's fire and brimstone, and if you don't do what you're supposed to be doing, you're going to go to hell. So you now have an argument between those two, and both of them are going to be coming over from Europe. Okay, these ideas, and it's just going to be two movements that are going to be going against each other at the same time, in which there are going to be debates, and most of these New England areas are going to be filled with the Great Awakening ideas, while more people down in the southern areas and middle colonies mostly are going to be more of your enlightened thinkers, give or take and whatnot. Another one of these things that's going to be occurring is going to be the John Peter Zenger trial. And what the Zenger trial was whether or not Zenger could print something in the newspaper against the government, in which he was found that, yes, because of what he was printing was true, the government could not censor him. I always tell my AP students this Zenger trial is can be used to make connections for other things that are going to be happening later in the other periods. For example, when we get to the Constitution, when we get to rebelling against the British, when we get to the Sedition Act with the Alien Sedition Act of John Adams, when we get into the Espionage and Sedition Act of World War I, and even when we go into the Pentagon Papers and New York Times versus the United States during the Vietnam War. So this Zenger trial is kind of this beginning piece to make all of these other connections with these other periods. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind. Another aspect now of, period two is, I was starting to bring it up and then I kind of backtracked myself a little bit to talk about other things, is all of the foreign wars that are happening. Okay, the British are pretty much either fighting the Native Americans or the French. for the most part of this period too. And a lot of the reasons why is because it's going to be offshoots of European wars. Okay, so wars that are happening in Europe that didn't just kind of trickle down into the colonies, they really aren't that big of a deal until you get into the French and Indian War. Okay, so like I said, we're going to stop when we get to that French and Indian War aspect of it because that will be part of period 3, and period 3 is then just going to be, a little bit longer than some of these other ones because of the amount of information that's going to be coming through. One last aspect that I do want to bring up in period 2 is salutary neglect. Okay, it was this idea that England had pretty much said we need to leave these colonies alone because they're already prosperous. This was done by Prime Minister Robert Walpole, who was during the Hanover dynasty, which is going to be all your Georges. Okay, like King George, the third, who is eventually going to be the one that Americans fight the independence, more against the American independence for him. But so he pretty much says, look, if the colonies are already producing and they're already economically sound through this idea of mercantilism, and mercantilism is that wealth equals power. So the more money and resources that a country gets, the more powerful they're going to be in Europe. So it's the idea of exporting more than you import, selling your goods more than what you're buying. And a lot of this came down to resources, tobacco and sugar, and eventually it's going to be cotton, and then gold. Okay, so the United States, or not so much the United States, the colonies at this point are going to use this salutary neglect as a reason why, and when we get into period 3, leave the colonies alone, let us do our own thing, and let us run as we need to do or need to be. All right, so that is pretty much a brief overview of period 2 in about 12 minutes or so. There's going to be more videos to come. You can definitely, subscribe so you can see when these videos are coming up. I also am putting these onto playlists. I also have an AP Euro one going on as well. So I wanted to say thank you for tuning in, and good luck on your test.